Hello. Today I want to say a little about the life and times of the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, one of the most influential thinkers of all time. For ease of recording, I have divided the video into two parts. Locke's writings cover a wide range of interests. Today he is particularly remembered for two books, his essay concerning human understanding and his two treatises of government, both of which were first published in 1689. He also wrote on education, religion, the importance of tolerance, and economic questions of the day. I hope to be able to provide an overview of his thinking on these various topics in future videos. Retrospectively, Locke's life can be divided into four main periods. The first 35 years of his life, from 1632 to 1667, when he lived a conventional life, became a university don, and trained as a medical doctor. The 16-year period from 1667 to 1683, when he became associated with the Earl of Shaftesbury and his political circle. A 5-year period of exile in Holland from 1683 to 1689. And the final 16 years of his life, following his return to England in 1689 until his death in 1704, during which he published his major works, worked for the new government of William and Mary, and was widely feted as a public celebrity. The first period will be dealt with in this video, and the other three in part 2. Locke was originally from the West Country, being born in the Somerset village of Rington in the summer of 1632, and growing up in the vicinity of Pensford, a few miles south of the great trading port of Bristol. Both parents came from trading families, clothiers and tanners for the most part, and his father, John Locke Sr., practiced as a country lawyer and served as clerk to the Justices of the Peace in Somerset. The family was not rich, but owned or leased some houses and land. They were not quite members of the gentry, although Locke later described himself as a gentleman on the title page of the essay concerning human understanding. The family appear to have been Puritans, or of Puritan sympathies, and during the Civil War, Locke Sr. served as a captain in one of the parliamentary cavalry regiments. This was commanded by Alexander Popham, subsequently Member of Parliament for the nearby city of Bath. Popham was a useful contact and recommended his former captain's eldest son for entry into the prestigious Westminster School in London, which Locke entered in 1647 on a scholarship. He was then aged 14 or 15. Locke proved himself to be an excellent pupil, excelling in his studies of Latin and Greek, and learning enough Hebrew to compose an oration in that language shortly before he left the school. In May 1652, now aged 19, he won a scholarship at Christ Church, Oxford, taking up residence in the autumn of the same year. England had already changed massively during his lifetime. The Civil War, that had begun in 1642, when Locke was almost 10, had been brutal and bloody, and had effectively culminated in the execution of Charles I in January 1649, when Locke was still a pupil at nearby Westminster School. This had been followed by the abolition of kingship and the establishment of a Commonwealth government under the English Council of State in 1649. In the midst of these upheavals, teaching at Oxford remained highly conventional, and Locke, like the young Thomas Hobbes half a century before, developed an intense dislike for the arid scholasticism of the curriculum. He entertained himself by wide reading of English translations of French essays and other literature. It was easy enough for him to meet the requirements to graduate, however, and he received his Bachelor of Arts in February 1656, aged 23, and 2 years later his Master's. It is not clear what Locke's initial career intentions were. At that time, most undergraduates eventually became clergymen, and a smaller number lawyers or medical practitioners. Although Locke was admitted to one of the Inns of Court in London in December 1656, he never seems to have seriously considered a legal career, and was instead attracted both to medicine and the life of a college don. and in this latter role was appointed to a number of college offices in the early 1660s, taught rhetoric and Greek, and served as a college tutor. Locke had already begun intensive medical reading in the late 1650s and continued his medical interests for several decades, associating with Dr. Thomas Willis and later working with Willis's rival, Dr. Thomas Sydenham, two of the leading medical figures in 17th century England. He was also friends with Dr. Richard Lower, another medical pioneer of the period. Locke's medical interests naturally led to a wider interest in natural philosophy, the science of the day, particularly chemistry and physiology. He met the chemist Robert Boyle, probably in early 1660, and was already familiar with his writings. In addition to Boyle, he read Descartes and probably Gassendi, and through Willis and Boyle was one of the group that developed into the Royal Society of London. Locke was later elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society and briefly served on its council. He also drafted a short work on the purpose of respiration, a scientific problem of interest of the day, but did not publish it. Although Locke himself never became a major figure in medicine or science, it is clear that these early interests and his introduction to systematic medical and scientific research had a lasting impact, particularly the idea of careful and patient empirical observation as the basis for grasping the secrets of nature. As we read in a short tract from 1669, in Locke's handwriting, but probably composed by Sydenham, true knowledge grew first in the world by experience and observation. For Locke and Sydenham, only the proud laid down maxims about the operations of nature, vainly expecting nature and God to proceed according to these maxims. This empiricist approach to knowledge is, of course, characteristic of his later writings. During his Oxford years, Locke also wrote, but did not publish, a short treatise affirming the power of the governing authority to determine the form of religious worship. This was a conservative stance to take, and reflected Locke's support at that time for the newly reinstated King Charles II. Like many Englishmen, Locke had grown weary of the turmoil of the interregnum, and hoped that the re-establishment of the monarchy would bring peace and order to a divided land. Although Locke was now well established in the life of an Oxford don, he was evidently pleased to try something different when the opportunity presented itself, as it did in 1665, when he was offered the post of secretary to Sir Walter Vane in a diplomatic mission to the small German state of Cleves to treat with the Elector of Brandenburg. This was Locke's first journey outside of England, and was notable in introducing him to a society in which, in stark contrast to the England of the time, people of different faiths, Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists, lived peaceably together. As Locke himself acknowledged, the experience made him aware of his own religious prejudices. I will continue the story in part 2.